It's my privilege to be back home after being so far away for so long. Ruth Ann and I moved away in the early 90s. I promised her that when I retired, we'd come back to Oklahoma. As a native Texan, that was my for better or worse promise. I actually had planned that I would work until I die, so I didn't really think I was going to have to come back. But it's great to be back. This is home for us. And it's great to be back on the campus at Southern Nazarene University. I started teaching at Southern Nazarene University when I was 20. Not by design, but by accident. I was research assistant for Mel Thomas Rothwell, and he had to have emergency surgery. I'd taken some philosophy classes from him. There was nobody else around to teach the classes. And so here I was in the middle of my master's degree program teaching Introduction to Philosophy and History of Ancient, Medieval, and Modern Philosophy. It was all I could do to just simply stay ahead of the students, or at least a couple of them. The rest of them weren't moving real fast. That's when I first encountered this intellectual issue with regard to belief. The students in those classes didn't really particularly want to have to think. They wanted me to tell them what to think, and they wanted to write it down, and then they wanted to have a test in which they could write it down again and give it back. And if they could remember what I said in class, and if they could write it down and then give it back to me again, then they got an A, right? Or at least that's what they expected, was to get an A. When I left Southern Nazarene, where faith and faith formation and the connection of faith and learning is a fundamental part of the frame of reference, I went to a research university in which that simply was not the case. Those assumptions were not in place. And it is the case still today with regard to not just the culture of the college, but moving back into the Bethany area now after having lived in several different places and have traveled in quite a number of different places, I realized just how unusual it is to live in an area, to live in a community where belief is the established assumption. When I went overseas as an exchange student when I was 17, I'd come out of the Nazarene church, come out of the Nazarene context, and I found myself in a setting in the Netherlands with other people who were 16, 17, and 18 years old in the classroom. And for these European youth, belief was not axiomatic. Now that was 55 years ago. 55 years ago, belief was not axiomatic. In the community in which you live and work here, belief is for the most part fundamentally axiomatic. You're the exception to 99.9% of the rest of the people in the world, in the Western world. I also encountered something else in the European context when I was 17 years old, and that was in one of the classes that I had to take in the gymnasium in the Netherlands was a class that introduced us to the evolution of intellectual thought in the West. And I heard about the Enlightenment. And I heard about this frame of reference in which there is supposedly a kind of objectivity. And that objectivity then allows you to be set free from the superstitions of religion. Now that's some of the same kind of stuff that we've already heard about this evening from the physicists and atheists and agnostics and others. In many ways, they are still carrying on the battle of the Enlightenment because they have not figured out as philosophers how to move beyond the battle of the Enlightenment. And so they still work within a frame in which there is, we call that the Enlightenment or modernity. When we began to realize that there was no real such thing as total objectivity, that all of us have vested interest, that we are all raised with certain kinds of assumptions, and that we are social beings, that we are social creatures, and that we are shaped and formed into a kind of subjectivity, or as it were, a kind of intersubjectivity. So in place of total objectivity, there emerged a kind of total subjectivity and it made tremendous strides in Western society. Different strokes for different folks. What I assert or believe is my business, and it's just as valid as yours. That's the Twitter universe. Anything that somebody puts out there, they think that that's just as valid as anything that somebody else puts out there. And we have people who are chasing the Twitter world as if that in itself was actually an informed perspective. It's not an informed perspective. My students say, Dr. G, do you have a Twitter account? I said, no, Twit's Twitter. Of course, they don't think that's funny. I said, what can you possibly say? How many characters is it now? Has it expanded from 180 to 240? 280? Do I hear 300? The intersubjectivity, well, if I feel this way, and if I'm really sincere about this, what could possibly be wrong with that? Of course, the Bible says that you can believe a lie and be damned. But what if we just simply don't really know? What if we don't have any idea really what the possibilities are? Then the latest twit to come down the line, or is it tweet? Sorry, couldn't pass that up. The last tweet to come down the line becomes the conversation point. It becomes the frame of reference. It becomes the topic of the day. In an age of disbelief, and I want to posit to you, Tom invited you to consider doubt. I want to say to you, that all of us live with doubt in the age in which we live. Unless you're an absolute, totally consistent fundamentalist who's closed your mind to any other kind of possibility except the one that you have decided to live with, then you live with doubt. All of us, in a sense, are doubting Thomases, in that we don't know everything, and the thing is, we know that we don't know everything. And so we live in an age of disbelief in which belief is no longer axiomatic. As a matter of fact, not believing in God or believing while living as a practical atheist is the new normative. That's the new normative. For the last decade, I've seen that in my seminary students. When I taught at Emory, we had an older population. When I went to Duke, the median age of our Div School students was right out of college. The median age was 23 years and 4 months. And those young people felt called of God. They were committed to the ministry. They were going to be doing God's work in the world. And they couldn't understand why they didn't have the same kind of confidence in their Christian faith that their grandparents had. And they were confused. They wanted it, they believed it, but somehow they couldn't stop questioning. They couldn't stop doubting. because the world has squeezed us into a different kind of mold. A friend of mine in the UK says, in England says, if 1952 comes around again, the Methodist Church in England is ready. 52 ain't coming back. We have a worldview or social imaginary that's able to account for meaning and significance without any appeal to the divine or the transcendent. You know what our new appeal to authority is? The economy. What serves me economically? What's most important to me economically? It's the address in which I live. It's the kind of car that I drive. It's the kind of clothes that I wear. It's the kind of vacations that I take. It's what the value of my portfolio is. It's whether or not politicians that are going to get elected next time are going to help me to maintain the status quo of my style of living. That is the ultimate norm. It's not about God unless God is serving us. The idea of a transcendent realm, what Peter Berger called a number of years ago the sacred canopy. The sacred canopy is not just cracked, it is shattered. It's just not there anymore. Even for Christian people in our churches, the sacred canopy does not cover the way that it did for our grandparents and our great-grandparents. So we have an exclusive humanism that is creeping into every dimension of the structure of our society. And if we think that in our own church setting that it's not there, pay attention and look around. I think you're going to find it's there. So we have an increased fragilization, an increasing strong disbelief amid a practically atheism that renders shared belief and faith commitment fragile. It's put into question. It's dubious. My students want to believe, but they don't know how to believe. We have a buffered self. In this new emerging social imaginary, we are self-contained. We seek fulfillment without essential reference to the transcendent. The transcendent is reduced to my. 2 weeks ago, I was in England leading a group of people on tour before we went to the Oxford Institute, something we do every 5 years, Methodists and Wesleyans around the world. And since most of you are Nazarenes, you might be interested to know the largest contingent of seminary graduates at the Oxford Institute were graduates of the Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City. More NTS graduates at that gathering than from any other Wesleyan or Methodist seminary in the world. That won't get you a cup of coffee, but it's just an interesting. Tom, would you put that on Twitter so that people will know that, so we can get people talking about that? The lady who helped me put together the tour is a specialist in tours in the Methodist and Wesleyan tradition. Had a really good conversation with her, and she said something I've never heard anybody say before. I'm curious if you've heard it. She said, well, this morning in my quiet time, I was praying to my God. My God. Not to God, not to our God, but to my God. Have you ever heard that before? Someone praying to her God, his God, my God? This is in contrast to the buffered self. You see, or the poor self in contrast to the buffered self. The buffered self is closed. It's mine. I own it. I control it. And it's an interesting dilemma that those of us who self-identify as evangelicals discover, is that the emphasis upon personal religion altogether too easily becomes private and individual. And personal is not the same as private and individual. The poorest self is open. Sociologists tell us that the more we climb the ladder of economic independence, the more isolated we become from other people around us. When Ruth Ann and I were thinking about moving back to Oklahoma, we were over in Yukon and we looked at some lots over there. We looked at the possibility of a house, and a builder over there by the name, I think his last name was Nail. I think his first name is John. Anybody know John Nail by any chance? What a name for a builder, right? Nail. His dad was also a builder. I was really impressed with the quality of his houses. And he said, well, we're going to be opening a new development, and I really think you might be interested in this. And so we went over there, we looked at it. There was a nice sized lot. It backed up to a creek, had a nice tree line behind it. It was going to be totally private. And I said, wow, that is interesting. And he said, oh, what you're really going to like is that it's a gated community. I said, in Yukon, Oklahoma? Who are you protecting yourself against in Yukon, Oklahoma? Now, a number of years ago, I visited LeBron Fairbanks when he was the president at the Nazarene Theological Seminary in Metro Manila. You had a wall around your house over there, and you had pieces of glass stuck in the top of it to keep people from climbing over and carrying off everything that was loose. We live increasingly in a disenchanted order. And by that I mean, in an enchanted order, then we are open to the transcendent. We are open to God. We are open to the possibilities of spiritual and moral dimensions that can't be tied down to economics. They can't be tied down to social structures and defined and confined by social structures. We are open. That's an enchanted order. But we live increasingly in a disenchanted order. And the typical response to this is what Charles Taylor in his book on secularity, which is where all this stuff comes from that I'm using. This is not original with me. It's about so thick, so if you have a couple of years, that you want to kind of spend trying to figure out something, get a copy of that. A disembodied and de-ritualized construal in which faith is turned into a belief system. Fundamentalism. It's an interesting thing that those of us in the Wesleyan tradition have so succumbed to many of the assumptions of fundamentalism when that is antithetical to the holiness in Wesleyan tradition. It is fundamentally antithetical. That's another whole lecture for another whole day, and if I keep going, you're not going to invite me back, so I need to finish up. In an age of expressive individualism, each of us has our own personal way of realizing the fullness of our humanity. Conformity to models imposed by others, read church, is out. And so the church tries increasingly to be relevant by not having any specific expectations about norms, but by allowing the individual to define the norm. And it totally flattens out truth. But what we do then is we nail down, we believe this, we believe this, we believe this, we believe this. If you believe this, you're a Christian. If you don't believe that, then you're not a Christian, which means you're not really like me. I want to offer you a possible new kind of construal. This isn't new with me either. Susanna Wesley gave this to John Wesley. Because John Wesley said, it's all right, you can say amen if you want to, that'll be okay. Amen. Wesley came to her and he said, I believe that this and this and this is true, and I am willing to submit my mind to that truth. To give mental assent to something as being true. Susanna said, Jackie, which is what she called John, Jackie, mental assent is not adequate to the subject under consideration, which is God. To give mere mental assent that something is true is not adequate. There must be fiducia, Susanna said, a sure abiding trust that the truth is transformational, accompanied by a willingness to be accountable to a faith community and to live into holiness. An accountable Christianity that is more than a mere mental assent, but it is a journey of discovery into transcendence. It's a journey of discovery into the holiness of God. It is heuristic, that is, it is characterized by discovery. And the life of holiness, the life of sanctification, the life of Christian perfection, the life of going on to perfection is a life which has to continually be characterized by discovery. There won't be easy answers. There won't be quick answers. If you want a quick and easy answer, don't go for holiness. Or if you want to reduce holiness to a mere mental assent as something being true, then you miss the point about holiness. Thank you very much.